Thank you. We're going to talk about Angular 2 forms and validation, and I wanted to start with just a quick little demo. This is the Movie Hunter application to help you hunt for a movie to watch. And of course, since we're doing forms, we're mostly interested in the edit page. So here, you can see that I have a validation going on. So when the title isn't there, it gives me a message. And when I put in enough characters, that message automatically goes away. But notice also that when I go to the add movie, all of my messages aren't just immediately appearing, even though the form is invalid. So it's smart enough to disable the save button, but not display all of the validation messages.
The screens are flickering, so we're going to...
Oh.
1 second.
Okay.
We're going to switch it.
Anything you want to talk about while we're waiting?
What? Are you working on any Pluralsight courses?
Yeah. I can tell you about my Pluralsight course. I did a getting started on the beta, which is just great because now I have to redo it for the RC. But if you're interested in that. But to keep things moving, I'm going to keep talking about what I was going to talk about next, and we'll let them figure out what's going on with my computer. But you might have heard that Angular forms is that there are basically 2 ways to do forms in Angular 2. You can do template-driven or you can do model-driven. You've heard that? Yeah? Okay. So the main point that I want to make in this session today is that it isn't really one way or the other. Rather, it's more of a continuum, that you can do it template-driven, you can do it model-driven, or you can do it somewhere in between. You don't necessarily have to go all one way or the other. So what we're going to be doing is looking at 3 stories. The first story is completely template-driven. I'm good to go? Okay. So I'm going to catch back up with my slides here. Anyway, we saw the demo, right? So that's good. We'll go back to the slides. Okay. So if you are interested in the demo application, you can get it off my GitHub. It's just Deborah K. Try that, Dave. You can get the demo code and everything from there. So here is our continuum of creating forms from template-driven to model-driven. And as you might guess, template-driven, all the stuff is in the template. So when we create our forms, our input elements, our data binding, our validation, our error messages, all in the template itself. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So here's our form. It's our standard HTML form tag. We've got a submit event binding going on there. But what you don't see is that behind the covers, under the covers, whatever, behind the scenes, under the covers, we are actually getting some additional functionality here. Angular has an ng-form directive that it's automatically assigning to our form. Okay, with that directive, it can track all sorts of data. So it can track your form state. It keeps track of the list of controls associated with the form and each of their state. So all of this is happening behind the scenes. How's that one? You can also actually use it if you want. So I'm here using a HashEdit Form, which is a local template variable, and I'm assigning it to that ng-form directive. When I do that, then I can actually pass it, if I want, into my code so that my code can know what the state of the form is. It can know whether the user made changes, so not go off to the website and try to submit some changes if the user didn't even change anything. So that's all part of template-driven. How about adding controls to the form? Well, we've got our standard label, standard input, and because we're doing template-driven, all of our validation is here right in our template. So we've got required, min-length, max length. We're not really getting to Angular-ish stuff till we get down here. So here we've got our banana in a box, our ng model two-way binding, and we are using another directive called ng-control. What ng-control is doing is it's telling that ngform directive behind the scenes here that this control wants to be tracked. And it's going to be tracked by the name title. So if you started to actually look at that ngform data, the data associated with that directive, you'd see a control array in there, and it would have a control name title because we added this directive. This last thing then is adding another local template variable, and it's assigned also to ngform. And what that does is it sets up a reference to this one particular control so that we can then use that elsewhere in our template. And we'll see where we're going to use it here in just a second. All right, so that's defining our form and our control. Next, we want to deal with our validation. And there are two basic things that we want to do in our validation. One, we want to display some kind of message telling the user that something went wrong. And the second thing is we want to provide some kind of visual indication that something went wrong. And in my case, I'm reading both the label and the input box and the description of the error. So how do we do that? Well, here I'm just adding a set of spans, and I'm using an ngif, and here I'm using title.touched and title.errors. So where is that title coming from? That's that local template variable that we just defined. So this is referencing that data that the ngform is tracking for us about the state of our control. And then we're using touched and errors so that when we have that add screen come up, that it doesn't immediately show all these errors. And then here we're using ngif to display the appropriate error message. The second part of it was to color our text, so we wanted to color it all red so we could have a div around our label and our input box and these spans, and we're again using title there, which is that local template variable that references the control in the ngform. So what does our code look like in our component class? Well, the only thing we really need to do is manage that model, manage our movie so that we can do that two-way binding. And then, of course, we'd have that save method somewhere in those ... there. So when we're doing template-driven, you might have noticed that it's very similar to Angular 1. It uses ng-model for the data binding, so we don't have to worry about setting a default or tracking what the values are. And we're using ng-control bound to the control name. Our validation and error messages are in the form. So let's take a little step to the right and look at partially model-driven forms. So that's just what I call it. I'm sure it has no official name. So partially model-driven forms. We're still going to have our input elements. We're going to keep our data binding, so we'll still have our defaults and such. And we're going to keep our error messages also in the template. So that will make it easier for us because Angular will take care of displaying the correct error messages. But what we're going to move over to the class is we're going to define our controls, we're going to define our form, and we're going to define the validation in the class. So let's look at that class first. So in addition to having a property for the movie here, we're going to add a property for our form and for every control. And so so it would fit on the slide. I'm only doing 2 out of the set of controls, but you can imagine that there would be more here. So there is no form object per se in Angular. Instead, it's a control group. And any group of controls can be a control group, and you can have a control group within a control group. So we could have like an address block that we tracked separately from the overall form and so on. Our controls then are declared as of type control. So this is just declaring those variables. How do we set them? We would set them in the constructor. And in the constructor, we're taking advantage of Angular's form builder service. So we're injecting that into our constructor here. Then we're setting each one of our controls to a new control. And in the constructor, our first argument there is the default. Now, when we ran the edit, our code had defaults, our form had defaults in it, but we're not setting a default here. Why is that working? Any guesses? No? Because we have two-way binding going on. So we don't need to set a default because, as we had said, we're going to leave our two-way binding for this partially model-driven. So we don't have to set any default. The second argument here then is our validators. If we just had one, we could have just said validators.required, but since we have multiple validators, we use validators.compose. We repeat that for every one of our controls. Then at the bottom, I'm creating the form or setting up the form group for the form. So the form group method is expecting a collection of key and value pairs. So the key is the name of the control as it's keeping its name, and the value is the actual instance of the control. Okay, so we're going to be binding ng-control to this name, to this title, to this director. Okay, we're also going to be binding our title properties, our director property, and our edit form property. So let's take a look at what the form looks like. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell Angular that we are controlling the form in our model. And we do that with the ngform model directive. And we assign that to our property that we defined, our edit form. Then we have our submit the same. Now we don't ever need to pass edit form into our class because we already have it there. Okay, so that's what our form looks like. Our label and our input box look similar, but we no longer have the validation in here because we defined the validation in the code, in our I almost said controller, in our component class. The other thing that you notice that we don't have here anymore is our hash local template variable. We don't need that anymore because now we have a title property in our code. So we're still doing the two-way binding, and we're still binding ng-control. But we're binding ng-control to the collection that we've defined for our form. So it's that title name that we're binding this to. Okay. If you look at this code looks exactly the same as we saw in the template version of the code. What's different here, though, is title is no longer our local template variable. It is now the property of our class. So our property now knows about how to manage the validation. It knows about being touched or having errors, and so that's what we're binding this to. ng-class, the same thing. It's using the title property of our class. So when we take our little step to the right, we're using the new form builder. We're still using ng-model so that we don't have to have a default value. We don't have to manage any of that. We're using ng-control to bind between our template and our code. Our validation is now in the class, but our messages are still in the HTML. Now, why would we want to do this? Why would we want to put more code in our class? Well, one big reason, of course, is unit testing, because we would be able to unit test it. Another good reason, though, is we can add logic to it. So if we wanted to have the validation a little different depending upon the user, or different based on the state of the form, or based on whether the user clicked one radio button or the other, we can easily do that because we have all of the validation in code. All right, so now we're ready to take the next big step over to ModelDriven. So in the ModelDriven, we're going to put pretty much everything in the class. We're going to define the control, the form. We're going to handle our own default values, validation, error messages, everything. In the template then, all we will have is our input elements, and we're going to have that ng-control binding, which is going to associate the element in the template with the actual control that we've defined in the component class. Okay? All right. So if we define the form, you'll notice that this code looks exactly the same as it did before. We're still using ngform model. Here, the only difference is that we are no longer using the two-way binding. We're going to have to set the default ourselves. This is where the big change is, because we're no longer letting Angular kind of take care of for us displaying our error messages. Now what we've done is we've created a form error collection, and if that title element in that collection is set, it displays the title. So here it will, or displays the message rather. So if the title has an error, we set a message in here and we turn it on. So notice that there's no more logic in here. So this isn't deciding, do I do it on dirty or do I do it untouched? Do I do it on not valid or do I do it on it has an error? All of that logic is gone from our template and is now in our code. So all we're doing is if the code puts something into that form error collection and the title element, we're going to display it and we're going to turn it on. Same thing for turning it red. If there is an entry in that title element of the form error collection, we're going to turn it red. Now this form error is not something that's built in, it's something that I just defined. You could call it something else, but basically in addition to the definitions that we had in the partially model-driven, I'm adding this form error, and I'm defining it as a collection of key and value pairs. Each key is the control name, the value is the validation message that I want the template to throw up to the user. We initially want that to be empty because we don't want to initially display a bunch of errors. And we're going to need to write the code to populate that. Now what I did for this example is I just did a bunch of data structures in order to hold all of that. But in a real application, you might want to pull it from a file, pull it from a table. You could localize the strings, you could adjust the strings based on the user, and so on. Now, in the partially model-driven approach, we had used the constructor to define our controls and to define the group of controls that made up our edit form. But the problem with the constructor is that now we want to set defaults. So we want to have like this.movie.title in there. The problem is we don't have data yet in our constructor, right? We don't go get the data till like ng-init. And even then, we have to wait for it to come back from the server, so we don't have that data here in our constructor. So we're going to have to cut this code out and put it somewhere else. So I defined a method called onMovieRetrieved. This code is identical to the other code, we just moved it, and then we set our defaults, because now we have to have the defaults because the binding isn't going to do it for us. Okay. The other thing that it isn't going to do for us is figure out when to display our validation messages. We need to do that as well. So also in this onMovieRetrieved method, a little further down, we're actually going to subscribe to the value changes observable. So the edit form has a value changes observable that we can subscribe to. And we can think of that as the user's changes as being just a stream of data that's coming to us. We can then react to every single time that the user does something. So as soon as they type a character, we can take a look and say, oh, does it have a validation error yet? Oh, is the validation still valid? And so on, every single time that they type anything. So what does the OnValueChanged method look like? Well, mine looks like this, but again, this is just my code. You could do it however you want. All I'm doing here is looping through that form error collection that I defined. That just has a list of all of my controls and their associated validation error. I then clear it because it is possible that that last letter that they typed made it valid. Here is also where my logic is that's determining whether I'm displaying or not displaying this particular error. So in this case, I'm checking dirty and not valid. I could instead have it touched. But the nice thing about having it here in this code is we could make this code a shared service and ensure that we handle this the same through every single component instead of worrying about that new person who comes in making it touched when everything else is on dirty, for example. Then if it does have an error, I'm going through and figuring out which error it is and assigning the appropriate field, or the appropriate message rather, into the field in that form error collection. And as soon as that form error collection has a value in there, because of the interpolation binding that we specified, it will automatically appear in the template, it will automatically appear to the user, and it will automatically turn it red for us. Okay, so as soon as we go to fully model-driven, we no longer use ng-model. And as soon as we no longer use ng-model, then we need to provide a default, we need to handle changes and keep track of when to display validation messages. All right, so those are my 3 stories. Thank you so much for hanging in with me this afternoon. Thanks.